My name is Elise. I'm 29 years old. And last week, I buried my father. He was never a man of many words, but the silence at his funeral said more than I was ready for. No tears from my stepmother, no trembling hands from my half-sister, just tight hugs and tighter smiles, the kind you give when you know a secret and want everyone else to feel small for not knowing it. The service was held at the estate, the one I'd grown up in, the one they now pretended I'd never set foot in. I was wearing a black wool coat I'd borrowed from a friend in the city, the collar slightly too tight, but I kept it buttoned all the way up. I didn't want them to see how fast my heart was beating. The last time I was in that house, I was 20. I'd just dropped out of college, barely hanging on after my mother died, and he'd told me, very calmly, as though he were reading a recipe, that maybe I should go figure things out somewhere else. I figured things out. All right. I figured out how to survive on minimum wage, how to make pasta stretch 4 nights, how to sleep with one eye open when the locks didn't work and the landlord didn't care. But standing in that house now, looking at the leather chairs and marble floors and the enormous canvas of my father's wedding portrait, his second wedding, not the one with my mother, I realised something colder than grief was filling the space behind my ribs. I wasn't crying. I hadn't cried in years. There was a smell in the air I couldn't quite place. Not the flowers, not the food. It was the scent of clean wealth, polished floors, new perfume, someone else's legacy. When the lawyer arrived, he looked out of place, younger than I expected, nervous behind the glasses. He cleared his throat and read from the folder in his hand like he wanted to be anywhere else. To my beloved wife, Cecilia. To my daughter, Abigail. And then, silence. That was it. No to my eldest. No mention of Elise, the daughter from the first marriage. Not even a memory. Not even a token. Cecilia pretended to be shocked. Oh, Elise. I thought he would have. I'm sure this must be an oversight, but her eyes were sparkling in a way that made me want to scream. Abigail looked down at her nails. She'd had them done in a glossy pink, my mother's favourite colour. I felt the room tilt, but I didn't move, just nodded, quietly. Like a ghost, no one was expecting to show up at their own family's séance. Then, just as the lawyer began packing his folder, he paused. There was something at the bottom of his case, a white envelope, smaller than the others. My name written on it in handwriting I hadn't seen since I was a girl. Elise, he said, almost to himself. I was told to give this to you, privately. Cecilia's head turned so fast I thought I heard something crack. Abigail made a soft sound in her throat, something between surprise and protest. I took the envelope with both hands. It was sealed in red wax. Suddenly, the room felt too small, too full of eyes, too full of lies. So I walked out without saying a word. I didn't open it until I got back to my car, the same second-hand Honda I've driven since I was 22. The sun was setting. I remember the way it hit the windshield, gold and burning, like it wanted to blind me before I saw what was inside. Inside that envelope was a second will, signed, dated, notarized. And this one said everything they didn't want me to know. I must have read it 10 times before I let myself breathe. It wasn't long, just a single sheet, typed, with my father's uneven signature at the bottom. But the words carved a canyon between the version of him I thought I knew and the man who wrote this. To my daughter, Elise Marie Caldwell, I leave the properties registered under Caldwell Holdings East, including the farmhouse in Belmere, the adjacent lakefront cabin, and the 18-acre woodland parcel purchased in 1994. She is also entitled to the sum of $2.7 million currently held in the confidential trust account managed through Hawthorne and Finch. This supersedes all prior documentation. I regret the years lost. He had signed it 3 months ago. 3 months. While I was still working doubles at the cafe downtown, scraping together rent, washing dishes while the college kids complained about almond milk shortages, he knew. He knew they'd try to erase me. I stared at the signature, at the embossed notary seal, and suddenly the past 3 years snapped into focus. The missed calls, the 2 voicemails I'd never listened to, the single birthday card that came with no return address and no message inside, just $40 link tucked between 2 blank pages. My father had been reaching out, and I hadn't seen it. Or maybe I hadn't wanted to. A part of me, the part that had spent almost a decade trying to harden, wanted to laugh. Not out of joy, out of disbelief, out of a bitter, choking sort of irony, but another part of me, smaller, quieter, began to tremble, because this changed everything, and nothing. I folded the paper carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and locked it in the glove compartment. Then I sat there for almost an hour, engine off, hands in my lap, watching the sky bleed orange into violet, wondering what I was supposed to do now. They had smiled. They had celebrated. They had watched me walk away, thinking I had been erased for good, and maybe I would have been, if not for the second envelope. I didn't go back inside. I didn't need to see their faces again. Instead, I drove across town, past the old bakery, past the school I used to skip when the world felt too loud. I stopped in front of the Belmere farmhouse at dusk. It looked abandoned, shutters crooked, porch sagging, but still solid. I remembered the creak of the stairs, the smell of old pine in the kitchen. I didn't have a key, but I remembered exactly where my mother used to hide the spare, under the 3rd rock by the back steps. And just like muscle memory, my fingers found it. The house had been locked up tight, but not untouched. Dust everywhere. A few footprints, maybe a groundskeeper or someone sent to check occasionally, but no signs of life. Not in a long time. I walked through the rooms like I was moving through a memory. Each doorway whispered something I wasn't ready to hear. In the hallway, there was a picture still hanging, one I had drawn as a child. A crooked little house with a tree beside it, and 3 smiling stick figures. Mom, Dad, me. Abigail hadn't been born yet. They'd never taken it down. Upstairs, the bedroom windows were still covered with old curtains. My old bed frame leaned against the wall. The closet still held the raincoat I'd worn in 5th grade, faded yellow, with one missing button. I sat on the floor of that room for a long time, knees drawn to my chest, listening to the emptiness. For the first time since the funeral, I cried. Not for him, not yet, but for the girl I used to be, the one who thought love had to be earned, the one who thought being forgotten was her fault. When I finally stood up, the air felt heavier, but clearer. I wasn't angry yet. That would come later. Right now, I was gathering the pieces, because something about that second envelope, something about the way he had hidden it, handed it off privately, sealed it in wax like a secret he had to protect, told me one thing: he had known what they would do. He had known who they were. And still, he had tried to reach me. Maybe too late. Maybe not. But I wasn't going to let this fall into silence. Not this time. The next morning, I woke up on the living room couch, still fully dressed, my neck sore from the angle I'd slept in. Light was streaming in through the broken blinds, illuminating motes of dust that swirled like tiny ghosts above the coffee table. I sat up slowly, heart strangely still, like I'd spent the night beneath something heavy. Not fear, exactly, but weight. The kind of weight that comes with knowing you've been holding your breath for years, and now you don't have to. I made coffee in the old enamel pot, scraping together beans from a tin someone had left behind. It tasted like ash and memory, but it was warm. The farmhouse creaked with every movement, groaning like it remembered me but couldn't quite believe I was back. By noon, I was downtown. I walked into Hawthorne and Finch without an appointment, hair tied back, wearing the same coat from the funeral. The receptionist looked up, professional, polite, until I gave her my name. Then her smile dropped a fraction. One moment. "Miss Caldwell," she said, disappearing into a side room. I waited, stared at the marble tile beneath my shoes. It was white with veins of grey, like something out of a museum. Beautiful, sterile, cold. A moment later, the lawyer, James Halberd, I remembered now, stepped out to greet me. He looked even younger in daylight, like a man playing dress-up in someone else's life, but his handshake was firm, and when he led me into a private office, his tone shifted. "I imagine you've read it by now." I nodded. He closed the door behind me, sat down carefully across the wide oak desk. "What I'm about to say hasn't been officially acknowledged in any family proceedings," he began, voice low. "But I want you to know that your father was very specific about how this second document was to be handled. I didn't speak. Just watched his hands. They were trembling slightly. He came in here 2 days after a meeting with your stepmother. Something had changed. He was shaken. I've worked with him for 12 years, and I've never seen him like that. What did she say to him?" He hesitated. "I don't know. But whatever it was, he didn't trust her after that. He made me swear not to file this version with the others. Said if anything happened to him suddenly, and I quote, 'I want Elise to have the truth, even if it's only in her hands.'" I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw. He knew he was dying pancreatic. He said softly, "Stage 4, diagnosed 8 months ago." I stared at him. He didn't tell me. James didn't respond right away. Just looked at me with something almost like sympathy. He wanted to. He said you hadn't answered his calls, that he'd failed too many times already. I closed my eyes. And there it was again. That sharp, gut-deep twist of guilt I thought I'd buried. But James wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, reaching into a locked drawer. He pulled out a flash drive, still sealed in its plastic sleeve. "What is that? A copy of the audio?" He recorded his explanation. I blinked. He left me a message." James nodded. "Said he didn't want you to hear it from anyone else. That this was for you alone." I took the drive with both hands. It was light, too light for what it held. I didn't listen to it right away. Not in the office. Not in the car. I drove back to the farmhouse, closed the doors, pulled the blinds, sat on the floor with my laptop and stared at the loading screen like it might shatter me. When the audio finally clicked on, his voice filled the room. "Hi, Ellie." He hadn't called me that in 10 years. "I don't know if you'll hear this. Maybe you'll throw it away. I wouldn't blame you." His voice was hoarse, older, thinner than I remembered. "I should have come to you. I should have been there when she died. I should have taken you in. But I didn't know how to hold grief in one hand and raise a daughter with the other. I failed you. And then I tried to bury the failure under a new marriage, a new house, a new family. I was frozen. I couldn't breathe. But I never stopped watching. I saw your name on the bakery roster. I followed your art blog until it shut down. I even drove by your apartment once. Couldn't bring myself to knock. There was a pause. Long. Heavy. Cecilia. She's not who you think she is. Or maybe she is. And I just didn't want to see it. But when I told her I was rewriting the will, she smiled. Told me it was cute, that I still had hope for redemption. Another pause. If this reaches you, it means she won. At least for now. But you have the truth. The documents, the properties, the cabin. There was a sound, a cough, sharp and hollow. Inside the cabin, there's a safe. Behind the fireplace, your mother's journals are in there. And something else. Something that made me realise what I let happen, what I ignored. I stared at the screen, shaking. I'm sorry. Ellie, I love you. I just waited too long to show it. And then, static, silence. I closed the laptop, sat in the dark for a long, long time. Somewhere inside me, something was shifting. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something sharper, quieter, like steel being drawn from a sheath. I waited until morning to drive to the cabin. I don't know why. Maybe I needed the sun to remind me I wasn't dreaming. Maybe I needed to sit in the farmhouse one more night, to feel the walls breathing around me, to remember who I used to be before everything unravelled. The cabin was an hour north, tucked into the woods like something from a forgotten novel. No one had been there in years, judging by the tyre tracks or lack of them on the gravel road. The branches reached low, brushing against the windshield like they knew me. The keys were under the lantern by the door, exactly where my mother used to hide them. I paused before stepping inside, my hand on the brass handle. The air felt still, expectant. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first cedar, dust, and something older. Not rot, just time. The furniture was covered in white sheets. Light filtered through the cracks in the shutters like blades. It was like walking into a room someone had just left, 20 years ago. I moved slowly, my boots echoing on the wooden floor. The fireplace was straight ahead, stone, wide, with an iron poker set still standing. I didn't hesitate. I knelt down and ran my hands along the bricks, remembering a childhood game, hide and seek, where I'd once discovered a loose panel behind the firewood. And just like that, it clicked. The brick gave way under my fingers, and behind it was a small steel safe. I stared at it for a long moment. The combination came to me suddenly. Not numbers, but dates. My birthday, my mother's, the day she died. It opened on the first try. Inside was a bundle of leather-bound journals, the kind my mother used to carry in her oversized purse. I lifted them gently, one by one. There were 5. They smelled like ink and smoke and rain. Beneath them was a manila envelope, thick, heavy. I opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, and documents, legal ones, contracts, bank transfers, letters. The photos came first. There was one of Cecilia, sitting in a restaurant I didn't recognise, smiling, but not at my father, at a man across from her, a man I recognised, my uncle, my father's younger brother, the same man who'd been at the funeral, offering me condolences with glassy eyes and a trembling hand. More photos followed, of meetings, intimate dinners, handwritten notes, passed between them, dates, locations, years. Some dated back to when my parents were still married. My stomach turned. And then came the letters, my father's handwriting, slowly unravelling over time. He'd written everything down, his suspicions, his guilt, his quiet investigations. In one, dated 6 months before he died, he wrote, "I have reason to believe Cecilia has been working with Thomas for years." Their goal was to redirect the estate and isolate Elise completely. I've reviewed the will drafts. The language was altered without my signature. I was not of sound mind when I first signed the prior version. I was medicated. I want this corrected. Elise must know. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. It wasn't just that they'd cut me out. They'd rewritten history. They'd forged signatures, redirected funds, created a paper trail so clean, so subtle, that no one would question it, unless they were looking closely. My father had started to look. Too late, maybe, but he had tried, and now all of it was in my hands. I sat down on the edge of the couch, one of the journals in my lap. I opened the first page. My mother's handwriting stared back at me. If anything happens to me, Elise, know this, I loved you more than the sun. I saw things I shouldn't have, but I stayed for you. I'm writing everything down now, just in case. Tears slipped down my cheeks without permission. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a quiet, calculated theft of trust, of legacy, of memory. They hadn't just excluded me from the will. They tried to erase my mother, erase me, rewrite the ending. But I had the real story now. The pages, the documents, the photos, the recordings, all of it. And I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to storm into their mansion and throw the papers in their faces. No, I was going to do this the way they did it, quietly, precisely, irrevocably. Let them think I'd walked away. Let them think they'd won. Because by the time I was done, every truth they buried would be unmissable. And this time, it would be me writing the ending. It started with a phone call. Not to them. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hear their voices just to listen to them lie. No. The first call was to someone else. A name I'd found scribbled in the corner of one of my father's letters, Marjorie Lane. Forensic accountant. Retired. Discreet. I found her number in the yellowed corner of an old Rolodex buried in the farmhouse desk. When she answered, her voice was clipped, cautious. But the moment I mentioned my father's name, there was a pause, then a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep. "I wondered when you'd find me," she said. Marjorie met me the next afternoon at a diner halfway between towns. She was in her 70s, with wiry white hair and the kind of eyes that had seen through decades of fraud. When I slid the envelope across the table to her, she didn't even flinch. "Your father gave me part of this," she said softly. "Told me to follow the trail, but not to file anything unless I heard from you directly. Said he wasn't sure how deep it went." "How deep does it go?" I asked. She took a long sip of her tea, then looked me square in the face. "Deeper than you think. But you're holding the match now. Sweetheart, just depends on when you want to light it." And so I did. The next few days blurred into quiet action. I made copies, digital and physical, stored in 3 separate locations. One went into a safety deposit box, another to a private email set to auto-send if I didn't log in every 5 days. I contacted a lawyer, a real one this time, one who didn't have dinner with Cecilia on Saturdays or play tennis with Uncle Thomas on Tuesdays. Her name was Naomi Vega, sharp as glass, slow to trust. But when I showed her the safe contents, her expression changed. She leaned back, tapped a pen against her lip, and said, "Let me guess. They thought you'd never find this." I nodded. "They're about to learn what happens when someone like you does. Naomi helped me start the paperwork. We weren't going after the money. Not yet. That would come later, in courtrooms and silence. What I wanted first was truth. Because here's the thing about truth, it's not loud. It doesn't need a stage. It just needs oxygen. I began leaking. Not headlines, not scandals, but emails, screenshots, select pages from my mother's journals. I sent them to a former journalist I'd met during my barista days, a woman named Paige who had once been blacklisted for publishing a corporate whistleblower story no one wanted to hear. She owed me nothing, but she remembered me. She remembered how I used to sketch customer portraits in chalk on the cafe wall just to keep from crying on slow shifts. "This is heavy. Elise," she whispered after reading. "Are you sure?" "No," I said, "but it's not mine to carry alone anymore." The next week, the cracks began to show. The Caldwell Foundation, which my stepmother chaired, suddenly pulled out of a major grant. Rumours began circulating in private forums. Anonymous tips started appearing in inboxes. Then came the message, "Abigail. Hey, Elise. Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time. We hadn't spoken since the funeral. Not directly. She was never cruel in the way Cecilia was. At least, not on the surface. She was the kind of cruel that came wrapped in lavender perfume and gentle pity. She didn't lie. She just let the lies grow like ivy around her. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the message to Naomi. "Watch them," I said. "They're starting to sweat." 3 days later, another email came in. From Thomas. "We should clear the air. No lawyers." I laughed out loud in the silence of the farmhouse. The same man who used to hand me $20 bills like charity now wanted civility. And still, I stayed quiet. Because silence, when intentional, is power. And in that silence, I could see them start to fracture. Cecilia was no longer smiling at the gala photos. Abigail had locked her social accounts. Thomas had quietly removed himself from 3 company boards. The press hadn't gone public yet, but they were circling, and I was still here, in my mother's house, surrounded by the pages of her truth, with the fireplace behind me and a journal in my lap. I lit a candle that night, just one, set it on the windowsill, not to burn anything down, not yet, just to remind myself that light, no matter how small, is still light, and soon they'd see it too. I woke to rain the next morning, not a storm, just a steady, grey rhythm, soft and patient, the kind that seeps into the walls and stays there. I watched it fall from the bedroom window, curling my fingers around a mug of black coffee. The cabin creaked with the weight of memory. Something about rain always made my mother restless. She used to say, "Water remembers what the world tries to forget." I didn't understand that as a child. Now, I did. By noon, I'd received 5 more messages. One from Abigail again, her tone more urgent now. "Elise, this is getting out of control. If you're behind this, please just call me." I was past needing her to understand. Understanding had never been part of the way they treated me. They mistook silence for surrender. They mistook distance for disappearance. And now the consequences were echoing in the spaces they left hollow. The second message came from a journalist I didn't know. Someone Paige must have passed the story to. She wanted comment. On the family's internal dispute, I said nothing. Then came the legal notices. The foundation had launched an internal audit. Cecilia's name was quietly removed from several board listings. A charity gala was postponed indefinitely. It was working. And yet, I still hadn't felt it. That satisfaction. That imagined moment when revenge tastes sweet and clean. All I felt was clarity. I wasn't ruining them. They had done that themselves. All I had done was open the windows and let the rot air out. Later that evening, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I hadn't done that in years. The woods had grown denser, darker. Everything smelled of pine and soil and the past. I reached the edge of the property where the woods met the lake, and I sat there for a while, watching the reflection of the trees ripple in the water. That was where I made the decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to apologize. I wasn't going to wait for guilt or grace or some gesture of decency. I was going to finish what he started, what my father was too afraid, too slow, too broken to finish. And not for him. For me. I returned to the farmhouse and pulled out the original will, the fake one, the one Cecilia had paraded at the funeral. I placed it side by side with the second version, the one sealed in red wax. Naomi had filed the necessary paperwork to open a probate challenge. But I wanted more than just legal correction. I wanted the truth printed, visible, undeniable. I reached out to the private estate paper, a monthly publication distributed quietly among the city's wealthiest families. I sent a letter to the editor, anonymously, with exact documentation, verified images, and a soft little statement. Sometimes legacies are rewritten. Sometimes it's not the dead who are silent. It's the living who are too loud with their lies. They published it. And with that, the private world they'd built began to splinter in places they couldn't glue back together. At first, I thought they'd deny everything. But then came the visit. I was on the porch of the cabin when I saw the car. Black, sleek. The kind Cecilia liked. She always said luxury should be discreet. She stepped out in heels far too high for gravel, holding a small umbrella, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask to come in. Just stood there beneath the weight of her designer coat, like it might shield her from what she already knew. "Elise," she said, her voice low. I didn't answer. She took one step forward. "You've made your point." I almost laughed, but I didn't. I let the silence speak. Her mouth tightened. "You think you're doing the right thing, but all you're doing is destroying what's left of this family." I leaned against the doorframe. "No," I said softly. "You did that. You just didn't think anyone would notice." She looked away then. For the first time, she looked old. Not in years, but in weight. Like someone who had been wearing a crown made of glass for too long and had finally realised it was cutting into her scalp. "There's still time," she said quietly. "We can fix this. Come back. Abigail misses you." My heart didn't move. "She posted a picture of me as a waitress 2 months ago," I said, captioned it, "Rags to Still Rags." Cecilia flinched, just a twitch, but I saw it. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. The wind blew slightly. Her umbrella turned inside out, and for a moment, just a brief one, she looked human, but I didn't move to help. She fixed the umbrella, straightened her coat, and looked at me one last time. "You'll regret this, Elise." "No," I said quietly. "You will." And then she turned, walked back to her car, drove off without another word. I stood there long after she left, the wind tugging at the hem of my sleeves, and for the first time in years, I felt still, not finished, but certain. The next message didn't come by text, or email, or phone. It came folded, hand-delivered, no return address, slipped beneath the door of the cabin sometime in the early morning while I was asleep. I found it after waking up from a dream I couldn't remember. One of those dreams where you're falling but never hit the ground. The envelope was cream-coloured, thick, with my name written in sharp, tidy script. Elise. I sat on the floor to open it. Inside was a single piece of paper. No greeting, no signature, just a sentence. You don't understand what your father was protecting you from. That was all. No threat, no plea, just that. I stared at it for a long time, letting my fingers smooth the grain of the paper. It smelled like cologne. I hadn't smelled in over a decade. Faint, expensive, bitter. I knew instantly who it was from. Thomas. Of course it was. It was the kind of manipulation he excelled at. Not a denial, not an apology. Just enough of a riddle to plant doubt, to make me question the version of truth I was slowly constructing. And for a moment, it almost worked. What had he meant? What had my father kept from me? But then I looked at the rest of the table, at the journals, at the recordings, at the documents, affidavits, records of fund transfers traced and confirmed by Naomi and Marjorie. No, they'd had their chance to tell the truth. Now they were just trying to control the ending. I folded the letter neatly and slid it into a new folder I labelled distractions. And I got back to work, because there was still one last thing I needed to do. The farmhouse. The property was legally mine now, confirmed and filed. But there was a final room I hadn't gone into, not since I was a child. The attic. It had been my mother's studio. She painted there when no one was looking, sometimes at night, sometimes when my father was away. I remember her humming through the floorboards. After she died, the room had been locked. Cecilia claimed it was too painful for my father, but I always suspected the truth was simpler. It was too inconvenient, too hers. I found the old skeleton key in the back of the silver drawer. The door creaked open with a sound like memory cracking. Dust exploded in the air like smoke. Light filtered through the skylight, casting long lines across the room. The easel was still there, covered. I stepped forward and pulled the sheet away, and underneath it was a painting I had never seen. It was of me, not a child, not from memory. It was me, older, as I was now, painted with warmth, with quiet strength, with a kind of grief caught mid-expression. She had painted a version of me she had never lived to see, but one she somehow knew I would become. Tears filled my eyes before I even realised it. She had known how lonely I'd feel, how invisible. She had known what I would grow into, not broken, not small, but someone who would remember everything, someone who wouldn't let it end in silence. On the back of the canvas, there was a note, scrawled in paint, still legible beneath the layers. For when they make you feel like you don't exist, you do. I see you. That night, I hung the painting above the mantel, not as a symbol, as a witness, because I was almost done being quiet. A week later, Naomi filed the final case. We were going public. Not for scandal. For record. The foundation would have to address the misappropriated funds. The will would be contested, publicly and irrevocably. The private letters between Cecilia and Thomas, authenticated and dated, would be submitted for judicial review. Page's article was being picked up by a national outlet. Names would be redacted. At first, but the implications would be impossible to ignore. And I would say nothing. Not a press conference. Not a tweet. Not a statement. Just a photograph of the farmhouse, posted quietly on my old art blog, which I reopened after 7 years, captioned only inherited, not earned, but reclaimed. The comments came fast. People remembered me. The girl who used to draw on cafe napkins and leave them for strangers to find. The one who disappeared. And now, the one who came back. Not for revenge, but for clarity, for truth. I received one last message from Abigail 2 days after the post went viral. This time, it was a voicemail. Her voice was soft, hesitant. Elise, I don't know what's left between us. Maybe nothing, but I wanted you to know. I didn't know about the painting, or the journals, or the real will. She paused. I just thought you left. I thought you didn't want us. Another pause. Longer. I was wrong. And for the first time, I almost believed her, but not enough to call back. Not yet. Some healing needs distance. And I was still learning what peace sounded like when it wasn't performing for someone else. The farmhouse felt different now. Not warmer, not louder, but awake, like some long-buried part of the house and of me had started breathing again. I cleaned, not because it was dirty, but because I needed to move, to wipe the dust off the things they left behind. I found my mother's scarves still folded in a drawer, her old brushes still resting in a jar near the attic window, bristles stiff with dried colour. Even after all this time, her presence lingered like the last note of a song you didn't know you missed until it was gone. The painting of me, the one she left behind like a quiet prophecy, stood watch over the living room now. Sometimes I would glance up at it mid-sentence, mid-thought, and feel something in my chest shift. A reminder you are not what they made you feel like. I didn't check the news often. I didn't need to. Naomi kept me updated, calmly, professionally. She told me that Thomas had stepped down from his position at the brokerage firm, that Cecilia had requested an internal audit be postponed for health reasons, and Abigail had gone quiet altogether, but not gone. The silence between us wasn't angry anymore. It was just still. Paige's article finally dropped. It was long, investigative, and clinical in tone, but underneath it, there was a clear pulse, the erasure of a woman, and the slow, deliberate return of her voice. She didn't use our names, but everyone who needed to recognize them did. I expected backlash, some ugly corner of the internet to attack me, but instead, something stranger happened. People started writing to me, women, mostly strangers, telling me their stories of families who silenced them, fathers who left them out, siblings who erased them with politeness and inheritance clauses. One message stood out. They called me ungrateful when I asked why I wasn't in the will, as if asking for my own story to be seen was a betrayal. You made me feel like maybe I wasn't the crazy one. I stared at the screen for a long time after that. Maybe that was the only real revenge truth passed like a torch. Quiet, glowing, undeniable. I printed that message and folded it into the back of my mother's final journal. It felt like closing a chapter the right way. That weekend, I walked the grounds of the cabin again. The leaves were turning. Crimson, gold, rust. The world shifting colours like it knew what I was doing. Letting go. There was a tree by the lake we used to picnic under. I sat beside it for hours, watching the water lap against the shore. It was peaceful in a way that didn't feel like an escape. but a return. I found myself whispering a name I hadn't spoken in a long time. Mum. It came out small, but it didn't break me. I said it again, firmer, rooted. I'm okay now, not whole, not healed, not perfect, but okay. When I returned to the farmhouse that night, a letter was waiting on the front steps. Abigail again, but this time it wasn't typed. It was handwritten, just a page, folded once. Her cursive was still too perfect, like she'd practiced it all her life. Elise, I don't expect anything from you. I don't even know what I'm hoping for by writing this. Maybe I just needed to stop pretending I didn't care. I looked through Mum's closet today. Not Cecilia, our real one. The one I used to pretend wasn't mine because it was easier that way. I found a picture of us. You were holding me. I was maybe 2. You looked like a kid yourself. You always felt older to me, like a stranger I was supposed to be close to but never was. But I looked at that photo today and realised you were holding me, like I mattered. I'm sorry, not for what they did, but for what I didn't say, what I didn't ask. If there's ever a version of the future where we talk again, I'll be there. If not, I understand. I read it twice, then once more, and then I slid it into the drawer beside the painting. Not to forget, not to forgive, yet. But because some wounds don't need to be pressed every day, some just need a room to breathe. That night, I opened the windows. The air smelled of pine and smoke and distant rain. The cabin sighed with it, and I slept without dreams, not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped needing them to lose in order for me to finally feel free. The first snow came earlier than expected. It dusted the edges of the lake and softened the lines of the trees until everything looked unfamiliar again, like a painting waiting to be signed. I stood at the window that morning, watching flakes gather on the porch railing, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was bracing for something. I was just watching, being. It had been months since the funeral, weeks since the story broke, days since Abigail's letter, and yet time didn't feel linear anymore. It felt circular, looping through old memories in slow, deliberate spirals. I found myself thinking about my mother more, not in grief, but in rhythm. I'd hum the same lullabies she used to sing under her breath. I'd make tea in her chipped green mug, the one she'd always reached for first. I was becoming a quiet echo of her, and instead of resisting that, I leaned in. In one of her journals, I found a pressed wildflower, still intact, still blue. Beneath it, she had written, "Beauty survives things we don't talk about." That's how you know it's real. I didn't cry. I just closed the journal and rested my hand on the cover. There are some truths that don't break you. They just settle into you like a second spine. That day, I drove into town, not for errands, not for confrontation, for something simpler, something I had postponed for too long. The bank. I met with the estate manager, signed the remaining property transfers, and moved the trust into my own name. The numbers didn't faze me anymore. They weren't validation, they were just numbers. What mattered more was what I decided to do with them. I bought a small art studio downtown, the same building where I used to take classes as a teenager. I restored it quietly. Fresh paint, new windows, a coat rack by the door like my mother used to have. And I reopened my blog. Not anonymously this time, not hidden. I called it Second Inheritance. My first post read, "This is not a revenge story. This is a memory reassembled. For every woman told her silence was politeness, For every daughter who learned to disappear, here I am. It spread faster than I expected. I began receiving letters from women across the country. Not comments, not DMs, letters, handwritten, folded, sealed, posted. They told me about grandmothers left out of family Bibles, about mothers whose names were erased from deeds, about sisters asked to be understanding while their brothers inherited everything but the guilt. I kept every letter, pinned them to a board in the studio, one by one, until the wall looked like a patchwork of unseen lives. And in that space, painted with echoes and reclamation, I began to teach again. Small workshops, quiet ones, art not as product, but as processing. We didn't talk about the articles or the scandal or the family name. We talked about hands, about lines, about colours we thought we'd lost. Healing doesn't always arrive as an apology. Sometimes it arrives as someone else's brushstroke beside yours. And then one day, she came. Abigail. She walked into the studio like a shadow, stepping into sunlight. No makeup, hair in a knot, a sketch pad tucked under one arm. We didn't speak at first. I simply nodded toward the spare seat. She took it. She didn't cry. Neither did I. We painted in silence. That night, she left a small drawing on the table. 2 girls, sitting under a tree. One is older, holding a book. The younger one is reaching for it. Beneath it, she wrote, "I'm ready if you are." I didn't respond, but I placed the drawing on the studio wall, not under forgiveness, not under regret, just under beginning, because that's what this was now. Not an ending, not a closure wrapped in a courtroom ribbon, but a beginning I chose. Mine. The lake froze that week. A thin sheet of ice stretched over the water like a held breath, delicate and deceptive. I stood on the shore one morning, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise and disappear, and I realised I hadn't thought about them in days. Not Cecilia, not Thomas, not even the will. They had become distant echoes, like the sound of the old wind chimes that used to hang by the back porch, present, but no longer disruptive. Peace wasn't loud. I was learning. It didn't arrive with celebration. It crept in slowly, on quiet mornings and unshaken coffee mugs, in the way I no longer startled at the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. At the studio, the wall of letters had grown. Every time I opened the mail slot, I found something new. A story, a poem, a simple line of gratitude. Thank you for reminding me I exist. They told me to move on, but I'm not done being found. You gave me back my name. And then came the invitation. A small non-profit focused on intergenerational trauma and female storytelling wanted to host a showcase. They asked if I would be the keynote. Me. I laughed when I read it, then cried right after. Not because I doubted I could do it, but because somewhere inside me, younger version of myself, the version that used to sit at the edge of my own bed with hands clenched in fear, wondering if I had made myself too small to notice, finally exhaled. I said yes. The event was held in a renovated theatre downtown. Small, intimate, packed with women who wore grief and grace like matching scarves. I wore my mother's earring, or the ones I'd found in a jewellery box in the attic, tucked beneath a sketch she'd never finished. When I stepped onto the stage, I wasn't nervous. I looked out into the crowd, let the silence sit for a moment, and then I said the first sentence that had formed in my mind weeks ago. They told me I was not enough to inherit, but I inherited anyway. I told them the story, not with names, not with specifics, but with truth. I spoke on Mibauti Rasha about quiet cruelty disguised as etiquette, about the moment you realise silence was never yours, it was given to you like a chore. And then I read something from my mother's journal, a passage I hadn't planned to share. When you grow up in someone else's house, you forget that the floor remembers your footsteps. One day, it will remind you who walked here first. There was silence in the room when I finished, and then, not applause, but breathing, deep, unguarded, like everyone had been holding something too tightly and could finally let it go. After the event, a woman approached me. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with silver braids and a velvet scarf. She took my hand and said, "You didn't just tell your story. You gave us permission to tell ours." I held her hand for a long moment, because I knew exactly what she meant. That night, back at the cabin, I lit a fire. Not out of necessity, the heat worked fine now, but because I wanted the sound. The soft crackle, the way it warmed the silence without interrupting it. Abigail had sent another letter. I hadn't opened it yet. It sat on the kitchen table, waiting. I was learning not everything needed to be handled immediately. Some things could be tended to in time, on your own terms. I spent the next few days sketching, not for anyone else, just for me. I drew the farmhouse again, the tree by the lake, my mother's hands, and then I drew myself. Not the self from the painting she left behind, but the one I had become, older, wiser, standing alone, not because I was abandoned, but because I had chosen to be still. When I finished, I placed the drawing beside hers on the mantel, daughter beside mother, witness beside witness. The story wasn't over, but the part where I was invisible, that part was long gone. I had been cut out, buried, dismissed, but I had returned, not to fight, not to beg, not to burn it all down, but to stand, fully, clearly. And this time, no one could rewrite me. I finally opened Abigail's second letter the following morning. The cabin was quiet. Snow piled up gently outside, the whole world blanketed in silence, like nature had hit pause. I sat by the kitchen window, where the frost painted ghostly patterns on the glass, and unfolded the envelope with careful fingers. This one was longer than the last, more unsure. The handwriting trembled in places. It began simply, "I keep rewriting this because I don't know where to start. Maybe I should have said everything sooner, but I was afraid of being wrong, of being complicit, of hearing how much I missed and how little I did about it." She went on. She wrote about memories, small ones. How I used to braid her hair before school while Cecilia complained about her own roots in the mirror. How I stayed with her in her room when storms made her cry, long after our father had stopped getting up at night. How I'd made her laugh once when she was sick, telling her she'd one day own a tiara, and she believed me. I don't know when I stopped seeing you as my sister and started seeing you as a threat. She wrote, but I remember when I started echoing Cecilia, how I let myself be softened by comfort, and I let your absence become convenient. There it was, the honesty, quiet, messy, late, but real. She ended the letter with a single sentence. If there's a version of this story where we find each other again, I'm still reading. I closed my eyes and let the words sit inside me. I didn't know if I had forgiveness yet, but I knew I had space. And sometimes, that's the most generous beginning you can offer someone, not a bridge, but a place to wait while one builds. That afternoon, I returned to the studio. It had become something more than a workspace, more than an echo chamber of broken women trying to reassemble their stories. It had become a refuge, a cathedral for the voiceless. That day, I taught a new kind of class. Not art, not painting, silence. We sat in a circle. 10 women. No phones. No names. I asked each of them to bring an object they'd been afraid to look at. A letter. A trinket. A photo. A document. Something that reminded them of the silence they had been assigned. I placed mine in the centre first. The forged will. The one that had almost rewritten me out of existence. Then I sat down. One by one. They followed. A wedding ring. A hospital bracelet. A crumpled sticky note with a name crossed out. A key. A broken phone. An unopened email. A faded report card. A voicemail saved for years. No one spoke. No one needed to. The objects said everything. And in that quiet, we found the truth that language sometimes smothers. We had all been cut from something, and we were all still bleeding in our own ways. But here we were, not erased, not forgotten, seen. After the session ended, I walked through the studio alone. I paused by the board of letters and noticed a new one had been pinned in the corner. No name. Just a line written in black ink. I didn't inherit anything but the silence. So I made a song out of it. I smiled, because that's what we were doing now. Turning silence into structure. Turning grief into something that could be held without shame. Turning the second envelope, once a secret, into a beginning that no longer needed permission. That night, I stood outside the farmhouse and watched the sky. It was the kind of clear that made you feel small in the right way, reminded you that your story wasn't the only one, but that it still mattered. I thought of my father, of the version of him I'd heard through a recording, tired, remorseful, late. I thought of Cecilia, probably alone in her corner of the estate, trying to script a version of events that no longer held power. And I thought of my mother, the way she painted futures she'd never see, the way she'd left behind not a map, but a mirror, one that had finally shown me who I really was, not someone waiting for a seat at the table, but someone building her own room, lit by letters, filled with women, framed by truth. And for the first time, I believed it. I had not been cut out. I had stepped out. And now, I would never disappear again. It was almost spring when the estate's final hearing was scheduled. By then, the snow had melted into soft earth and scattered puddles. The trees were still bare, but there were signs of life returning. Small buds at the tips of branches. Birds calling out in the early morning hush. I wore grey that day, not black. That belonged to grief, not white, that belonged to reinvention. Grey was something else. Solid. Neutral. Honest. I walked into the courthouse alone. Naomi was already inside, seated at the long table, calm and composed. Across from us sat Thomas and Cecilia, their lawyers flanking them like sentinels. Abigail was there too, in the second row, not beside them. Not beside me. Somewhere in between. She didn't look at me, but I felt her presence like a thread pulled taut across the room. The judge was a woman. I don't know why that mattered, but it did. She had eyes like someone who'd heard every excuse, every manipulation, every attempt at erasure disguised as legal procedure. And when she opened the folder and reviewed the documentation, both versions of the will, the supporting statements, the audio files, the notarized affidavits from my father's medical team, she didn't blink. Her decision was clinical, professional, but when she declared the second will valid and binding, I saw something flicker in Cecilia's carefully controlled face. It wasn't defeat. It was disbelief. As if she'd always known this moment might come, and still hadn't prepared for it. Thomas didn't say a word. Just gathered his papers and walked out first, jaw clenched, eyes forward. Cecilia followed seconds later, heels clicking like punctuation marks in a sentence no one wanted to hear. Abigail stayed. She stood up slowly, waited until the room had cleared. Then, for the first time since we were girls, she looked me directly in the eye. Her voice was small. "Thank you," she said, "for not letting them erase her. She meant our mother, but I think, in a way, she also meant me." I nodded, not with anger, not with softness, just acknowledgement. She walked away without waiting for a reply. I stepped out into the light. It wasn't bright, but it felt earned. Later that day, Naomi and I sat in the cafe I used to work in, the one where I'd served lattes with forced smiles, scraping rent from tips and dreaming of escape. We ordered tea. No need for coffee anymore. I was done running on adrenaline. She raised her cup toward me and smiled. "You did it." "No," I said. I told it. There's a difference. Revenge is about reclaiming control. Truth is about reclaiming self. The money that was incidental. The land, the house, the studio. They were roots, but they weren't identity. What I had now was something far less fragile. Wholeness. It had taken betrayal. Silence, erasure, and eventually, a second envelope. But here I was, still standing, still speaking, and still choosing how the rest of the story would go. That night, I returned to the farmhouse and pulled out the final journal, the one I hadn't opened yet. My mother had left it blank, all pages empty. I understood now. It wasn't unfinished. It was an invitation. So I wrote the first sentence they left me out, and in doing so, made space I could finally claim as mine. Then I turned the page and kept writing. The silence after the verdict felt different. It wasn't tense or heavy, like waiting for the other shoe to drop. It wasn't triumphant either. I hadn't stood on a podium or won anything with applause. It just was a stillness I hadn't known how to want until I had it. In that quiet, life began to expand again. The world wasn't made up of lawyers and letters anymore. It became grocery lists, half-finished sketches, cups of tea left forgotten beside open books. I started walking again. Not to think, not to plan, just to walk. The lake was still too cold to thaw completely, but the edges shimmered where the ice had begun to melt. I'd walk its perimeter each morning, boots sinking into damp earth, the air crisp and honest. One morning, I saw her again, Abigail. She was sitting on the old bench near the trailhead, the one Dad built when I was 12. I almost didn't recognise her. No makeup, hair loose, a sketch pad open in her lap. She didn't look up when I approached, but she didn't leave either. I sat beside her. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Just the sound of the lake creaking under the shifting ice, and the scratch of her pencil on the page. She finally spoke. "I come here when I miss her." I nodded. "Me too." More silence. Then, without turning, she said, "You used to hum when you washed my hair." I blinked. "You were the only one who didn't pull—" It was such a small memory, buried somewhere in the dusty corners of childhood. But suddenly, it hit me. The lavender shampoo. Her tiny hands clutching the tub. The way I tried to be gentle, even when I was barely more than a kid myself. "She deserved better," Abigail said. So did you. I didn't know what I deserved. I replied, until I was left out. That made her look at me. I didn't fight for you, she said quietly. I nodded. You didn't have to. That was the lie they gave us, that love is a competition, that someone has to lose so another can win. Abigail closed her sketchbook. Her hands were shaking. I want to try, she whispered, not to fix it, just to see what's still there. I looked out at the water. There was a reflection of us, blurry in the broken ice, two women who had once been girls holding pieces of the same mother, the same grief, the same betrayal. And even though I didn't know what came next, I nodded. Okay, we didn't hug, we didn't cry, we just sat, letting the space between us hold the weight of things unsaid. Later that evening, I returned to the studio and added a new section to the wall. It was smaller, more private. A single placard hung above it. The ones who stayed, and beneath it, a letter I wrote by hand, the first I'd written to myself. Dear Elise, you survived what they didn't even notice they did to you. You weren't forgotten. You were underestimated. You didn't burn it down. You outgrew it. You didn't lose everything. You found yourself in the ruins. Keep going. Not to prove them wrong, but to keep becoming right for yourself. Love, you. I pinned it to the wall. And then I stood back, watching it sway slightly in the warm air of the studio, lit by the afternoon sun pouring in through the tall windows. The light touched the edges of every letter on that wall, every folded confession, every shard of voice that had once been buried beneath someone else's story. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't known before. This wasn't just the story of what I had lost. It was the story of everything I was finally free to build. Spring came slow, like someone apologizing without words. The trees bloomed in cautious bursts, soft pinks and shy greens, and the lake finally released its ice, rippling open like a long-held breath. I spent more time at the farmhouse than I ever expected to, not because I needed to reclaim it anymore, but because it no longer felt like a place I had to survive. It had become mine in the quietest way, not through court decisions or signatures, but through ritual, opening windows, humming while folding laundry, watering the rosemary that now grew in a cracked blue pot by the porch. Some mornings, Abigail joined me, not often, just enough. She'd bring coffee. We'd sit by the same window, not trying to repair anything, just being near what remained. She told me she had started therapy, that she was writing again. She read me part of a poem once, short, fractured, lovely. I didn't know how to respond, so I just said, "That sounds like Mom." Abigail nodded. I think I'm finally grieving her. Not the image I was told to remember, but the real her. The one who painted instead of attending charity brunches. And I said, "Then you're getting closer." We didn't call ourselves sisters out loud, but something was threading itself back into place. Slow, unsure, but real. Meanwhile, the studio blossomed. What had started as a room with letters and paint had become a place people travelled to. Women who had followed the story, found their own courage, and now brought pieces of themselves to share. One day, a mother and her teenage daughter arrived from out of state. They said nothing when they walked in, just stood in front of the wall of stories, holding hands. Then the mother whispered, "This is the first time she's seen someone who didn't get swallowed. And I knew they weren't talking about me specifically. They were talking about the room, the feeling, the proof that survival wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like soft colours on quiet paper. I started hosting writing nights, not for publication, not for performance, just for truth. One prompt I gave them was simple: write the sentence they tried to erase from you. The answers made my chest ache. I was there, too. It hurt more than I said. I wasn't weak. I was dismissed. I did love her. I mattered. And again, I remember. That became the name of the project. I remember. Dozens of anonymous pages collected, printed, and displayed at a travelling gallery. Not signed, not claimed, just held. Each one like a second envelope. Every time I walked the exhibit, I could feel the ghost of who I used to be, watching from some corner, not jealous, not sad, just gone. And that was okay. You don't always carry your former self with you. Sometimes you bury her with honour, thank her for the bruises, and let her rest. One night, back at the cabin, I found something else I hadn't seen before, tucked behind the bookshelf, inside a box I must have missed. A small cassette tape, labelled only in my mother's handwriting. For when you forget who you are. I didn't own a tape player, but I found one at the antique shop in town. It barely worked. The sound warbled, but I played it anyway. And there it was. Her voice, soft, uncertain, recorded late at night. Maybe. The sound of wind in the background. She was speaking to me like I was already older. Elise, she whispered. You're going to wonder if you were difficult, if you were too much, if maybe they were right to forget you. But you weren't. You aren't. You were vivid. You were bold. And that scared them. They will call it selfishness. It's not. It's just that you shine in places they spent their lives dimming. Silence. Then a pause. And finally, don't let them write your story for you, even if they're family, especially if they're family. I sat with that tape long after it ended. Candlelight flickered across the old walls. The fire hissed low in the hearth, and I thought about how many women never got their second envelope, how many letters burned, how many names never spoken again. But I had mine. And now I could hold space for theirs. The first day of summer arrived without announcement. The wind was warm, the sun gentle. The lake shimmered like it was breathing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to leave the door open. Not figuratively, actually, open. I propped it wide, let the light spill into the kitchen, let the world in without armour. There were no letters that day, no calls, no updates from Naomi, no whispers from the past waiting to be dug up. Just a stillness that wasn't empty. It was complete. I spent the morning painting the front steps, the same porch I used to sit on as a child, waiting for a car that never came. Now I sat there, no longer waiting for anything. And that was the miracle. Not the inheritance, not the court win, not even the studio. Just this, that I no longer needed their validation to feel real. Later that afternoon, a woman arrived. She looked familiar. Not someone I knew, but someone who had read the story. I recognised the way she stood, hesitant on the edge of my space, like she didn't know if she was allowed to want healing. I invited her in. She had come to see the gallery. We walked it together, room by room, letter by letter, at the final wall. She paused before the section titled, I Remember, She traced her fingers lightly across one line. They said, my silence was maturity. It was actually fear. And she turned to me, eyes wet, and whispered, thank you. I didn't need to say you're welcome, because it wasn't about me anymore. That night, I stood in front of the painting my mother had left, the one of me. I used to think she had painted who she hoped I'd become. Now I saw it differently. She hadn't painted a hope. She had painted a truth, one she'd known before I did. A woman who could endure abandonment without becoming bitter, who could be erased and still reappear, not in vengeance, but in clarity. I took the last journal, the blank one, and opened to the final page. I wrote, they left me nothing, so I built everything, and it was enough. Then I closed the book, walked outside, and stood at the edge of the lake. The moon rose slowly, the water catching its light in ripples. The cabin glowed behind me. The studio lights, left on late, shone like beacons through the trees. I took a breath, not because I was beginning, but because I had finally, fully arrived. This was the end of their story, but not mine. Mine was just becoming quiet enough to hear its own voice, and this time I would write every word of it, myself.